My name is Walter Fratello. In this story, there's just me, Ike, and Lenny. Just three of us, three guys from Gillick Lake. We went to Europe all at the same time, and we came home from Europe within 6 months of each other. It was 13 people from Fairless County in all that got drafted. One was killed in Anzio, one in Colmar Pocket. The three of us got through without a scratch, relatively speaking. The paper did one of those stories about us before we went, good friends going off to war. Then we were forgotten. That's fine. The GI Bill sent Ike to engineering school. It got Lenny the money to start his landscaping business, and a month out of the service, I went right back to work for my father, who died in 1955. The three of us got together sometimes after the war, but now we were men, I guess, and the process of being adults slowly pulled us apart. Still, there were good times at the RINK in Steamville, where Coach Blake was still training up terrified sophomores. Whenever he saw us, he still called us the Three Bandits, and he swore it was the referees who cost us the county title in '39, not us getting creamed on the boards by St. Helen, whose worst player back then was probably better than even Ike. But hey, no bitterness. We played pinochle at Dex's pub sometimes, talked about women. We never once talked about leaving Gillick Lake. I guess some people think that's strange, but we loved it there. Where else would we want to go? We didn't talk about the war nearly as much as you'd think. A few times during Europe, we wrote to each other, and Lenny managed to come see me in the hospital before I got rotated, and that was when the war talk had come, the things we saw. In the middle of it all, the words came out, when we were trying to cling to being human, to living, trying to make sense of it all. The silence after we got home, though, I really felt it. I think they did too. Those years had eaten up something deep in us. But when we were together, it was just random anecdotes, the level of stuff you'd read in Reader's Digest in the Humor in Uniform column, frankly. We were avoiding. What we had, instead of traumatic battlefield stuff, was guilt. Lenny had been a merchant seaman in the Med. I'd mostly been a signalman, second class, on a troop transport, endlessly crossing the sea back and forth. Ike had the most ground time. He was infantry for 5 months before a broken clavicle from falling cement while he was on patrol rotated him to London, and some random brigadier general spotted that he was smart enough to contribute in other ways. Ike fired his rifle 10 or 12 times in combat. I'd fired mine twice. None of us had killed or wounded anyone. Lenny was the most in danger, really. His boats were targeted pretty often, and he was on a Liberty ship once that took a direct hit. He was in the ocean for 6 hours. It was definitely a different thing, not having stories for the people back home of risky charges or rushing pillboxes or landing somewhere under heavy fire. I did help carry a wounded soldier once to a house where a French family nearly didn't let us in. This little kid hurled cherries at us from a window. Soldier's name was Sidney. He'd stepped on a mine and half his foot was gone, and when he saw that, he went gray and started naming all the saints he knew. I never knew that had any salvation use, just naming the saints. If Larry Rose hadn't been killed in Algiers, maybe it would have been different. All three of us knew him from school, and that kind of followed us home. What no one in town ever really knew is that we didn't like him in school. He was kind of a weird, secretive kid, almost no friends. The kind of kid that once you graduate, maybe you see him around town sometimes, but you never even nod to acknowledge that, yeah, you used to be classmates. But after he died, the three of us agreed it was a lousy thing, and because of the Gillick High connection, we all got kind of fastened together in everyone's minds. So one day, 6 months after we'd all gotten back, we were eating subs at Patrick O'Smasher's, and Lenny, who was an absolute terror on the ice, but a gentle giant off it, said, we should go to his house and say something to his folks. And we did. He and I and Ike went over there, and we knocked, and his mother let us in, and we sat, and we talked about Larry like we'd all really liked him. And I think it did make his mother happy that one day. It was Larry's father that sort of chilled me a little, because he'd been in the Great War. In fact, I think he was the most decorated veteran of the First World War in the county, Lafayette Flying Corps. He asked us about our service, very specifically where we'd fought, really kept at it, asked us lots of questions. Mrs. Rose tried to get him off it even. And it felt like as soon as he realized none of us had seen the kind of action Larry had been shipped right into, he got cold. So cold I got uncomfortable, and we left soon after. I mean, he shook our hands on the way out. He thanked us for coming, but we'd struck a bad chord with him. I can imagine him that night lying in his dark bedroom, his only son gone, thinking, who were these boys to talk about my Larry? What did they leave over there? That's just the way the war had gone for us. Lenny told me once the biggest fight he really had was people's suspicions of him as someone born to Japanese parents. He dealt with that at sea almost every day. Told me sometimes he was glad they'd never lived to see the war start. And this was after the nonsense he'd had to take about it at school. He was the only one of us who signed up voluntarily. He wanted to fight. I couldn't aim for a guy's head, Ike told me once when it was just him and me fishing at Crump Lake. I aimed low, he said. Didn't even put any thought into it, it just took me over. I thought there'd be more guys like me, but no one ever talked about it. I missed anyway, I know it. I didn't say anything to that. The 2 times I'd fired, it was pretty much into smoke. Couldn't see much of anything at all. Then I got sick, like almost the end sick, from a hepatitis vaccine they gave us. And I got shipped to a different universe, really. We went to the town events when they asked, put on our uniforms, the whole thing, like we were supposed to, but we just wanted to go to Dex's right after, or the RINK, and move on. If this is going to be 2-3 times a year for our whole lives, Ike said once when the 3 of us were kind of drunk, and then he just trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't like going to those ceremonies because thoughts would suddenly go through my head, thoughts that were too much for me to process. They scared me sometimes, but mostly they were just overwhelming. On the 4th of July, they projected a huge photograph of Arlington National Cemetery on the side of the bandstand in the park, and I had the thought, looking at those rows of graves, it wasn't that they had wanted me to die. It was that they had wanted me to kill. It was bad enough we'd never really be the same after the war. I never heard of anyone who was. It did not feel good to be reminded that we'd come out of it all not just unwounded, but unable to honestly say, yeah, before the smoke cleared that morning, we gave them much worse than we took. Who'd have thought those words were something we'd ever secretly want to speak? But we did. The 3 bandits. One day in November of 1946, I had to drive some veneer logs all the way up past McClare, and I got real lost coming back because of a washout detour set up after the snow. I was alone driving down a windy thing called Bluebell Road, far north of Gulfport. Beautiful, crisp day. And the call of nature came, and I wasn't in a great position to hold out for a general store or a diner, so I turned off onto a dirt road that was nicely frozen over, and I killed the engine just as the road began to snake through the woods. And after walking a little ways for privacy and finishing my business, I saw through the trees to my right the most inspiring sight an old jock like me can see. You know, when you grow up obsessed with sports, you instantly judge every open acre by its possibilities for baseball or football or what have you. Well, the acre I spied through the trees was really something special. I left my truck where it was and weaved on foot through them for 100 yards or so. There was a pond in the middle of this nowhere, a nice big pond shaped like the bottom part of a guitar, more or less, and its surface was the most pristine natural hockey rink I had ever seen. I'd been playing on Gillick Lake in Littlebug all my life, and let me tell you, pond hockey is not easy. Every twig, every rock, every leaf stuck in the ice offers up another bump to destroy your ankle. There are so many flaws in the surface, you're almost better off putting on a pair of boots instead of your skates. You'll be faster that way. Skating on an open pond is an exercise in aggravation unless you all spend a half hour smoothing the area, and even then, you're always one bad turn away from twisting your leg into a pretzel. And as for using an actual regulation puck, forget it. It's too unstable. A baseball is the way to go. But this pond was almost without flaw, like someone had gone to work on it with a belt sander when no one was around. And really, no one was around. I didn't see any no trespassing signs or indicators of who the property belonged to. The area northwest of Gulfport was just farms and unspoiled open land, so I thought there was a good chance this was just a natural gift from God that I absolutely had to tell Ike and Lenny about. There was a convenient ring of grass all around the pond, 20 feet wide sometimes just 5 feet or so. The grass buried now under 4 inches of snow. Beyond that encirclement of grass, the bare woods crowded in on all sides. With our jobs and such, it was a few weeks before we could make the trip out there happen. I couldn't wait. We were going to make a full morning of it, bring beer and sandwiches. We could all use the exercise. Ike and I were working too much to really keep fit, and Lenny had been getting steadily heavier, even before he'd gotten back from the med. Maybe there was something psychological going on there, I don't know. But it didn't stop Ike from commenting cheerfully to Lenny that soon he'd stop being feared as the enforcer on the ice he used to be, and start having to squat in goal and let guys just run into his stomach. "You know, my father won't even go out there," Ike said to me when I stopped by his apartment on Tower Road. The comment was kind of out of context. Ike had his head underneath his faulty sink, rooting around with a screwdriver, so I had to ask him what he meant. The way I'd described my route to the pond, it sounded to him like it was somewhere on the edge of the Lyra forest. Ike's dad, it was a truck driver, and a real stern man. Wouldn't go hunting out that way, apparently. Had refused to for years. He was scared to. I laughed. I was always ready for another story of the elder Davis's paranoia. "He's afraid of the warlocks," Ike said. The old man's uncle had told him long ago that the Lyra forest was full of them from prehistory times. They would float around at night and draw big squares in the ground with sticks, and reality stopped inside the squares till someone rubbed the boundaries away. The warlocks got away with all manner of insanity that way, apparently, inside the squares. Really dark stuff. Ike's old man believed in all that. Believed in the warlocks. Believed in flying saucers and sea monsters, too. But at some point years before, he'd been out north of Gulfport in the woods with some buddies late at night, and they'd heard some sounds or whatnot, and they'd cleared out, and he never went back. My parents' generation got a lot of weird talk from their parents about the Lyra forest, who knows why. It was one of those places. Almost every small town imagines there's some faraway spot on the map where it's not safe to go. I saw Larry Rose's mom at the supermarket on the way back home. You saw everyone in town a couple of times a year in Gillick Lake. She was alone. She was getting a drink of water from the fountain outside before she went in. That's all. She never saw me. Just bent over the fountain to give herself a little water, something to make the moment a little better. Then continued her life, doing all the things she needed to do. Her son was just a half-mile away, in Old Township Cemetery, and always would be. November 19th, we drove out to the pond. It was first light when I pulled up at Lenny's house, and he came out with his stick and a thermos, grinning in an evil way because he was skipping out on work. Told the foreman he'd just hired that he was sick. We picked Ike up, and then we immediately got aggravated because Mitch Bashnagel, our fourth, a school teacher Ike had gotten to know from Dex's, only came as far as the door in his robe. Said he didn't realize his kids needed to be at his ex-wife's that day, blah, blah, blah. So he couldn't come, which left us with uneven sides. Harsh. We cursed his 40-year-old self. He seemed impossibly old to us, and we swore up and down that we would never become like that. I swear he was afraid he was going to have to ride in the open back of the truck, and that's partially why he bailed on us. We hit the diner in Fairless Bend. I'm really tempted to list everything we ordered because I know how much we used to eat for breakfast before hockey. Sounds impossible to normal people, but I'll refrain. 2.5 years of Army rations, remember? We would have got to Gulfport by 9, but now the detour had been removed, and I took 12-mile road to the area instead, which actually caused us a different delay. We were gassing up at an Esso. It was Lenny who pointed out something around the side of the building, something built in a little square lot where the snow was untouched. There was still a couple of inches in the ground from a good fall a few days before. 3 big, jagged stones, as tall as we were, lined up beside each other. There were plaques embedded in each one. I started to tell Lenny that we shouldn't be wasting too much more time with the weather so uncertain, but he'd already walked over there to check it out. Ike seemed to sense that he should too, because he got out of the truck and followed. I didn't have a choice then. It was a memorial to 2 nurses who'd lived in the area, both killed in Antwerp, and 1 infantryman killed at Tarawa. Someone had planted Queen of the Prairie around the stones, but it was well past its bloom. It might have become a nice little place eventually, that lot, just not then, right beside the gas station, an ugly ditch running right past. We all read the plaques silently. Then we were back, piled in the front seat of the truck, and talking about the Red Wings. Strange how I never once thought about what kind of flowers were around those stones until it just came back to me just a few hours ago, when I sat down to summon every memory I could, so I could write this story. The fellas were sufficiently wowed by my discovery. Although we had to sweat out finding the spot, the way was still confusing. I left the truck a little deeper in the woods this time, and we hiked through the trees with our hockey sticks slung over our shoulders, crunching through the snow. Lenny and Ike carried the goal net. That thing weighed more than an M1, I swear. The ice on the pond showed wavy traces of the most recent dusting, but aside from that, nothing had really changed. Ike whistled and asked where this thing had been all his life. Lenny got his skates on first and rushed out right away onto the brilliant surface of that pond. Living where we'd lived all our lives, you got to be an expert about what ice was safe and what wasn't, more or less, just by looking at it. And Lenny took that chance right away. He streaked across the entire length as fast as he could, demonstrating its near flawlessness. We got our gloves on quick before starting to play. The sun was staying stubborn behind the clouds, and it couldn't have been more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Ike had these convoluted rules about how to play with just 3 guys. We'd used them before at the rink in town, but Lenny and I both thought Ike had taken things too far in his super mathy brain. So for a while, we just knocked the puck around, doing drills. We didn't shoot much because missing on an open pond meant leaving the ice a lot and retrieving it from the snow. But it felt real good to thwack a slap shot right off the post and to knock the goal over once in a while. That was when you knew your velocity was nice and strong, when you could knock that thing over. So we did station passing for a while, and sometimes Lenny would hang around goal and challenge his reflexes in a 2-on-1 drill. I swear it was no less grand than when we were 12, back when I had to be convinced by Ike that hockey was the thing I needed to do, not baseball. Even though baseball had the cards, the trading cards, there were no good hockey cards back then. Only once did I hit a rough spot on the ice where some leaves had muddled the surface, and a nice suggestion of pain shot through my foot, and I resolved to slow down a little and be more aware of the bumps and of the ridges. You have to work your feet and your ankles out a little before you hit pond ice, you really do, to get them ready for the abuse. And if we stayed out there longer than a couple of hours, there was going to be hell to pay the next day. We'd just stopped for a bit to christen the first beer of the morn when we saw someone coming through the woods from the south. I heard Ike cuss, and we figured, the jig is up. It is private property. We're going to get the boot. Here we go. 3 men it was. But even before we could make out their faces, we saw that each of them was carrying a hockey stick. I looked at Lenny wide-eyed, and he looked at me the same way. Bingo. They were a little backwoods-looking, these guys, as they stepped out onto the ice and walked forward. About the same age as us, mid-20s. 2 kind of looked like brothers, stocky, sort of curly-haired, balding already. The third was definitely not related. He probably would have qualified as the tallest person in Gillick Lake. Must have been 6'5", 6'6", and he wore these strange, round, tinted spectacles, real small, like he was oversensitive to the light or something. One of the shorter 2 asked us if we were up for a game, and we said sure, absolutely. They even had their skates with them, hidden away in little knapsacks. We assumed they lived nearby, maybe even owned the property, and like us, they were ready to skate at a moment's notice. There were introductions, very crude, I guess is the word. No chit-chat. I remember their names. I certainly do. Brett, Cullen, and the tall one with the spectacles was Larson. We shook hands, but they were not terribly interested in that, you could tell. Just a meaningless ceremony. We set a couple of quick ground rules, nothing out of the ordinary. We'd swap offense and defense, 15 minutes each. We'd use Lenny's watch and just stop when we thought we were getting close and check. Pretty standard stuff. I was excited to play. What a stroke of luck to be able to square off like this with a minimum of fuss. It was tough enough to get sides going at Steamville. Brett, Cullen, and Larson headed to the far bank to get their skates on and have a quick nip from a flask they passed around, and then they came right back. We were on offense first. Don't give me Larson, I thought, just because the guy's height was so intimidating, and I didn't like that I couldn't see his eyes. What a great psych-out. But of course, he covered me for the most part while keeping a good eye on Lenny, and we saw right away that these guys were good, very good. Not the best skaters, but fast with the stick work, really sharp reflexes. Everything I tried to get past Larson, he was ahead of. And me and Lenny and Ike had to resort fast to creating a little chaos, trying some riskier passes and feints, stuff only Ike was really good at. The one named Brett had this bright yellow scarf that seemed kind of out of place because it was so impossibly clean and shiny. He breathed real heavy. When you got close, you could hear it, kind of a dog sound. It was tough to keep your breath that day out there in that kind of cold. We were more than halfway into our offense time before we even got a decent shot off. I sensed that Cullen hated protecting the goal. He wanted to be out in the thick of it, so he'd skate out real far to intimidate, leaving a lot of open nets. But every time I thought I had my shot, Larson would close in or his stick would flash out and break my rhythm. It was going to be maddening just to keep up with these guys. They played rough, too, from the beginning. Their kind of heavy contact felt out of place in 3-on-3 pond hockey. Maybe it's different out here, I thought. Without a ref, we didn't want to come on heavy with the crying foul, but these boys were all about hitting, something else we had to get used to fast. They would time their hits right at the arrival of the puck, and they had a habit of jumping the gun. Only once did Larson mutter, "My fault," after he took me down. But he didn't even help me get back to my feet, another faux pas where we came from. Brett kept high-sticking Lenny, but Lenny didn't say anything about it, even when the guy got him on the elbow once. Pretty egregious. Both Larson and Cullen converged on me when I had my best shot opportunity yet because of a terrific centering flick from Ike, and I knew I was a dead man. They both hit me, and I whiffed the shot, and the puck sputtered across the imaginary back line, and Ike finally cried foul. Our opponents looked at us like, "What's the problem?" as I stood up again. We didn't demand a penalty shot, but Ike, who definitely had his limits on the ice and in life, said in a not terribly friendly way that next time we'd ask for a 2-minute power play added to our offense time. "Just a solid hit, man," Cullen said, and skated back to the goalpost to sip one of the beers we'd offered him. He'd barely thanked us. It was kind of mockery, the way he balanced the bottle on the edge of the post, like he was confident the goal net would never get shaken enough with him there to knock it over. We switched. Them offense, us defense. Lenny protecting goal, Ike on Larson, me doing a zone thing till I could get a handle on what Brett and Cullen could do. It was a lot. They scored on us within 2 minutes. Larson nailed a wrist shot after deking me. Lenny beat his stick into the ice in frustration. After that, we seemed to agree psychically that we had to play a little rough too. Create chaos. That's what Coach Blake had always taught us. Only the pros, he used to say, have the ability to handle chaos. So I began to lunge in moments when it wasn't expected and give Larson a little stick action on the ankles. And Ike just plain attacked the puck when Brett tried to streak past him once, really took a gamble that worked. And if he happened to give Brett a late bump in doing it, oh well. At one point, when I should have cleared the puck in the middle of a swirl of bodies and been done with it, Lenny and Ike and I first had a little puck swap to tease our opponents a little. That kind of loose passing nearly cost us, but it felt good to maybe make them think we were a little nuts. Toward the end of their offense time, when they'd already scored 3 goals, they took things up a notch. Larson took an errant pass from Cullen and beautifully skated off balance to the net, where he released the puck right toward the gap between Lenny's feet. The shot somehow missed, went off the post, but Larson did not miss Lenny. He raised both arms and hit Lenny right in the chest. Lenny's head connected with the ice when he went down. I thought for a second I could hear it. "Foul!" Ike called. 2 minutes, man! Larson gave him a quizzical, innocent look. "He was in my way," he said blankly, a statement that meant absolutely nothing. "Too hard, way too hard," I added. And there was an ugly silence as we all looked at each other. Brett stood at the far edge of the playing zone, and I could hear his animal breathing that far away. "We're not giving anybody 2 minutes for love taps," he announced coldly. "Just swap. You're on offense." Maybe that was an acceptable trade by the rules, but it was meant as an insult. Whatever good feeling we'd had a half hour before had faded. We were tired, out of breath, and now it felt like we had something to prove, and whatever else that particular feeling gave us, it took all the fun away. Then the glasses thing happened. We mixed it up pretty good with these punks in the first few minutes of our second possession, relying on Ike's pure speed for him to get some space and praying my passes were on target. It was working. We tied it up on one of Lenny's patented all-or-nothing slap shots that always either scored or sent the puck deep into the cheap seats. Even then, he was hit late by Cullen, and he lost his balance, went down hard on his elbow. That made Lenny finally utter the first open insult of the day, something casual, just a warning shot across the bow, as it were, a statement that we weren't there for their amusement. Larson snagged the puck away from me effortlessly the next time I touched it, and he peevishly slapped it so hard it was guaranteed to make us go chase it. In that split second when I heard the crack of his stick against the puck, I had already thrown my shoulder into his, allegedly as a last-ditch grab to block his motion. I got him so squarely his dark spectacles popped off his head and landed on the ice. While Lenny skated slowly out to retrieve the puck, Larson stared me down like I had just slapped his mother. "Sorry," I muttered, and skated away. Larson bent down, picked up the specs, and covered his beady eyes again. Jesus, did he look mean. But smart, too, smarter than his 2 teammates by a mile. Without his specs, he looked like a clever assassin in a movie, hired to kill a foreign president. With them, he just looked cruel. After that, all 3 of them turned real bad. It was that contact that did it, I swear. Brett's stick was always high now. Cullen's every hit was late. No more courteous clearing of the puck, ever. It was knocked away at full strength sometimes, and I tried to use that dead time to calm myself down. "Every time you do that, we're adding 30 seconds. I called out over my shoulder the second time it happened, but to that there was no reply. Larson withdrew and left it to Brett to stay with me, that breathing getting more and more ragged as we all got more tired. Just before we switched to defense again, for the last time, Lenny stumbled on a seam in the ice we thought wasn't going to be a problem, and fell as he pivoted. Brett kicked the puck away, laughing. "Have a nice trip," he said. I was done with this right then, and I was about to call time and announce we had to be leaving. We were that close to it all being just another day ruined by guys who grew up not being able to handle losing. But I felt Ike's hand on my shoulder right then, with strange timing. He gave it one quick squeeze like he was saying, "Just one more round. Let them get their offense in." Try as they might, they couldn't score that tying goal. Lenny got tighter and tighter on the net, and this irritated Cullen to the point where he threatened to put him in there permanently if he didn't come out and play what he called real hockey. When Larson and Brett exchanged some hand signal, Ike looked at me and nodded. I'd seen it. They had some secret game-winning maneuver. Everyone always thought they had one. This version turned out to be a behind-the-back pass that Ike broke up with a well-timed lunge. But his feet got tangled with Brett's, and they both fell. Larson, 10 feet away, decided to retaliate. As he skated past me, he pushed out just enough to catch me off balance and sent me down as well. I landed on my right hand, and there was a flash of dull pain. It felt like the string of a bass guitar had been strummed in there. Lenny cried foul, and I got up, flexing my hand. "Game over," I said. "Enjoy your beers." "We've got like 5 minutes left," Cullen said, pulling up way too close to me, getting in my face. "Guess we forfeit," I said. "Congratulations." I can't really recount the ugly talk that came then with any accuracy, because some of us started talking over each other. At one point, Cullen stuck a finger in my face, and I turned my back and skated away as Ike took my place. The talk didn't last long. The upshot was that, according to the 3 wise men there, we were losers, didn't know the first thing about hockey, didn't understand the difference between playing dirty and playing hard. We all separated and went in 2 directions. I realized then, at the same time Lenny did, that part of Ike's face was smeared with blood. I told him to stop right where he was. He'd cut himself pretty badly in that last fall, but it could have been worse. He didn't pay it much mind. He just wanted to get off the ice. I heard Lenny call out something across the pond to those 3 scumbags. He was asking Brett to repeat something he just said while I'd been fussing over Ike's injury. We'd missed it. But I could tell from the expression on Lenny's face, an expression I'd seen before, that he'd gotten slurred. Brett, who definitely looked like the kind of guy who was into that kind of thing, didn't respond to the challenge. Cullen and Larson had reached the far side of the pond and were getting their boots back on. Then, I couldn't believe it, Brett, he of the yellow scarf, who was lagging well behind them, he turned and he threw his stick as hard as he could, end over end, onto the ice in our direction. It skittered and smacked against the back of Lenny's leg harmlessly. He could have just taken it, but he didn't. We stood for a second, stunned by how futile, but how hostile a gesture that was. Finally, Brett turned and skated off, grinning, his middle finger in the air. Far away, Cullen laughed. Ike hauled the net away by himself. Without a word, we got our boots back on, intentionally, not looking across the pond. Ike finished off the last part of his beer, which he'd left crooked neatly in the snow. I was the only one to turn back just before we headed into the trees. Our opponents were sitting comfortably on the far side of the ice, still resting. Larson sipped from the flask. Ike pressed snow onto his cut to make sure the bleeding had stopped while Lenny and I carried the net, which of course seemed heavier now. It caught on a root one time and we dropped it, and Lenny hurled a profane insult at it like he might to a human being. We traversed the woods quick enough, and we hoisted the net into the back of the truck and piled back into the front seat, backed down the icy dirt road, and started the drive home. Our silence continued on the ride, Ike beside me, Lenny squished a bit on the end. There just wasn't much to say, no conversation about how to salvage the day. It didn't seem salvageable. I turned the radio on. Sammy Kay sang The Old Lamplighter as we drove, peaceful white fields on both sides of us. My hands stung from the cold despite my gloves, and my nose was virtually numb. The guys stared out at the landscape, banged up and morose. Ike stopped giving his cut attention and let the blood trickle a little, not interested in it anymore. Lenny wrapped his scarf around his right hand and cinched it there for a while. There was a bar and grill sitting beside a body shop off 122, and I pulled into the parking lot without consulting them. Food and then back to bed for a couple of hours. That seemed like the ticket. There were no objections. Only after sitting in the truck for 20 minutes had our aches gotten the chance to settle in, and none of us made it to the door at quite a normal pace. We took a corner booth. The bartender came over and gave us 3 slips of paper on which someone had typed what they had to offer for lunch, told us to just circle what we wanted and bring it back up to the bar. He asked if he could bring us 3 beers, and Ike nodded. We stared at the menus, and I picked up a stubby little pencil and circled the word hamburger and a couple of things I wanted on it. Then I passed the pencil to Lenny. An old couple in the corner of the place put a coin into the jukebox, and here came Personality, the version sung by Johnny Mercer and the Pied Pipers, not Dorothy Lamore's rendition from Road to Utopia. The guys gave me their menus, and I took them up to the bar and handed them off. The bartender didn't even look at them, just walked them back to the kitchen. Not the friendliest of men. Behind the bar, over a colorful rank of liquor bottles, was an arrangement of photographs, all in frames. I saw the bartender in several of the photos. He was in uniform in a few, 3 or 4 years younger. Near a bottle of vodka, he'd hung a simple portrait shot of himself in front of a dark background, very clean-cut, inspection-ready, a smile on his face, a smile he didn't have for us. The photo my eye went to and stayed with before I turned back to my friends showed him outdoors, standing beside an impossibly frail-looking civilian, both of them looking toward the camera as if they'd just realized it was there. Other civilians, like this one, in similarly dire physical condition, wearing papery clothing, were milling around in the background among Allied soldiers. Some sat and smoked or drank from tin cups. There were no smiles here. The handwritten caption read, Mauthausen, May 1945. Our food was brought out, and we ate. Did we say anything at all? Didn't seem like it. Maybe Ike or Lenny made a comment about the weather. It was looking to go bad out there. The clouds were promising problems. Bing Crosby sang I Can't Begin to Tell You on the jukebox. Carmen Cavallaro on the piano. Though I am partial to the way Sammy Kaye did the song a year later. We didn't linger very long in that place. We hauled our tired bodies up and shuffled back out to the truck. A grim blast of wind hit me as I opened the driver's side door. I started the engine. Beside me, Ike closed his eyes and tilted his head back. I pulled out again onto 122 and turned right. The landscape began to roll past us again. Even 3 miles in, neither Ike nor Lenny, who were both watching the road just like me, made any comment about our direction. A couple of the barns we'd passed before turned up again, the one that looked burned out, and the one with the old gold tobacco ad on the side. The wind was now blowing snow across the road in serpentine sheets, and I kept the wipers on for when it really kicked up. I had to turn the headlights on for the last few miles back to the pond. I followed my own tire tracks back into the woods and killed the engine. Ike and Lenny got out on their side. I got out on mine. We reached into the back for our sticks, but this time we did not take the net. We left that where it was. We marched through the snow, bending our path this way and that to keep on track. We were at the pond again in no time at all. Lenny was flexing his hands against the cold already. We must have lost another 10 degrees in 1 hour. The sky was a merciless gray. Larson, Cullen, and Brett came out of the woods on the other side of the pond almost as soon as we walked out onto the ice. The 3 of them had their skates draped over their shoulders as they came. They dropped them into the snow at the pond's edge and went about the business of putting them on. Each man had brought his stick, of course. To stave off the iron claw of the wind. Brett had double-wrapped his yellow scarf and brought it almost all the way up to his eyes. He dropped his puck onto the ice idly, just kind of kicked it ahead of him as he skated lazily forward in a long, loping S. So much snow had blown over the ice that ghostly shapes formed and reformed constantly on the surface, swirling around us, then breaking up again. Brett kicked the puck toward Lenny, who stopped it with his right foot. He set his stick down on the ice when we were all facing each other near the center of the pond. I drifted to his left, Ike glided to the right. Lenny sent the puck towards me. Larson blitzed forward, and the moment I touched it, he brazenly barreled his left shoulder into me. With those tinted spectacles on, the landscape must have looked very dark to him now. Very dark. Ike took 2 great strides towards us and brought his stick high, gripping it tight on both ends and lunging at Larson's back. The giant tripped right over me upon contact. In response to this, Cullen swooped in, but Lenny met him and got his stick real low, going right for his feet. Cullen got tangled but somehow kept his balance, the blades of his skates going tack-tack and causing chips of ice to dislodge. The puck trickled away from us all and came to a stop somewhere. Larson was back on his feet already, unsteady. Still, he had enough strength to whip his stick around and try to catch Ike in the waist as he approached. Ike dodged. I was calculating my next move when I took a shot to the face and went down. My head hit the ice and stars exploded in my field of vision. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, involuntary, not quite sane. In the 5 seconds between my falling and trying to get up again, true chaos broke out. I saw Ike on his knees trying to get up, and Larson kneeing him in the side to get him to stay down. Lenny had grabbed Cullen's jacket at the neck and was slinging him around like a discus thrower, hurling him down. Cullen rolled and got right back up and swung his stick sideways. Lenny's eyes went wide and he cried out in pain as he took the wood directly on his hip bone. Then I was up, my head throbbing. The wind was sweeping through the trees, and snow was lifted in great vanishing blankets torn apart in midair. One enshrouded me, delicate as a spiderweb, as I skated back into the fray. Brett was coming at me, but he pulled up in defense when he saw I was already getting back to strength. He held his stick pointed out in front of him, gripped tight in both hands like a fencer, calculating. I swung mine, trying to knock his away. He took the advantage and tried to take my head off. I heard the savage whoop of the wood rip past my left ear. The bottom of his stick grazed across the back of my neck, bruising it. I heard Ike hollering nearby and caught a glimpse of his face. His chin had gone totally red, having been slashed. Blood spilled onto the ice. Lenny got away from Cullen and tackled Brett, pinning him to the surface of the ice. Lenny's gloveless hands, chapped and near frostbitten, went around Brett's neck. I had no time to react to it. Larson had swung his stick into the side of Ike's head. The flat end got him in the ear. I had to help him. My blow went into Larson's stomach and his glasses flew off one last time. I drove the butt end of my stick into his jaw. I heard a cracking sound even over the wind, and he staggered backwards, teeth tumbling out of his mouth. Then I went for his gut again, whipping the stick around so hard I nearly toppled. I got every inch of him, and he fell to his knees. Then over entirely. I turned. Cullen was skating away. It was like he was trying to disappear into one of the snow phantoms that grew, shuddered, and faded with every gust around us. Lenny got to him first. He took his legs out, and when Cullen rolled over, looking up at us with genuine fear in his dumb, rabbit eyes, he tried to shield his face from our blows. Lenny knelt down and drove a fist into that stupid face. I remember a snow phantom shifting direction in midair and crashing into me, filling my vision with glittering fireflies when it broke apart. And then Lenny wailing to my left, not in pain, but in a scary exclamation of victory of a kind, as someone begged him to stop. Please stop. I remember seeing Larson's entire body skimming the ice like a thrown doll. He was face down, and his head wobbled as his chin hit bump after bump, the flesh there torn open. But who had thrown him so hard into that helpless slide was not known to me. He stopped sliding close to my feet, and I raised my stick and brought it down. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing a mammoth dark cloud above that was silently splitting, separating into two, riven by a growing, jagged, cadet gray line of sky. I had lost my knit cap and my hair was soaked. Cullen's face floated past me, gleaming with hatred, his nose mashed to a pulp. One of his ears had been cleaved partially off his skull. Who let him up? I thought, and skated in on him. He was trying to get to Brett, but Brett could be of no help to him now. My last strike probably rendered Cullen unconscious before his knees hit the ice, then his chest and head as he toppled forward with no resistance. I ran over Larson's spectacles on my return to where people were still upright, and limbs were still being moved in both aggression and self-defense. Larson himself was all but done for. He was staggering in no certain direction, one arm held up uselessly to the sky. His jacket had hiked up, and I saw blade cuts crisscrossing the skin of his lower back. Then he took a last stick blow to the chest, dead center, and he stopped moving altogether. I felt myself being pulled backward at the waist, and when I spun to confront my assailant, it was Ike. He was pulling me away. Somehow he had both my stick and his in his free hand. I'd lost it somewhere. I'd been susceptible. Lenny was simply standing on the ice and staring, looking dazed. Thick and steady snow fell on our shoulders. There had been a time jump. I understand concussions can cause such things. We were leaving the ice. Don't look, Ike was saying to me, his face very close to mine. He wouldn't let me turn around. One of his eyes seemed to have been permanently sealed over. Lenny skated up behind me and laid a gentle hand on my shoulder to guide me. We drifted in a broken mass to the far edge of the ice. My teeth were chattering. I had never been so cold. My hearing went in and out, and I missed something Lenny was saying to me. He said it again, and I read his lips. Keep moving, he was saying. The process of shedding our skates and getting our boots back on was done without even sitting down, fast and clumsy. Ike was saying, come on, come on. And then he had plunged into the trees. The snow was so heavy I had to keep my eyes on my friends' backs to navigate. But that snow was comforting, too, I will say. I had never seen the color of fresh blood contrast with pure new snowfall. Looking down at the droplets on the powder, there was a very primitive beauty to it. We did stop to look back just before we lost sight of the pond altogether. The three bodies lay closer to the edge of the pond than I would have thought, at the far end, as if they had been trying to get off it, trying in vain to reach that border, and they had all failed. All of them face up. I wondered if their mouths were open, if they were taking the snow like it was communion. The amount of blood on the ice was sort of fascinating, just in a scientific sort of way. The snow would likely cover it up in less than 20 minutes, and if it kept up, the bodies themselves would be mere humps, like gingerbread men, in a couple of hours. Our ruined sticks were thrown into the back of the truck. Mine had split neatly up the center. Ike took over the driving. My head was full of gravel and nails, and Lenny couldn't put any weight on his right foot. He had hobbled all the way back to the passenger side door. The headlights threw weak yellow circles ahead of us, and we pulled out not long before we would have lost enough traction to get out of there at all. The clock on the dashboard made no sense to me. It claimed it was only a little after 1 p.m. Ike lit up a cigarette and stared at the road ahead, focusing admirably on every subtle and skillful turn of the wheel, keeping us steady and on the path and not sliding across it. Reaching the main road was a small victory in itself, and after the turn, which caused us to fishtail ever so slightly, we could safely get up to about 20 miles per hour. Lenny leaned forward beside me very suddenly and pounded his fists on the dash and laughed crazily, his eyes gaping like a madman's, spit flying from his mouth. "The 3 bandits!" he cried, his teeth grinding. The blood vessels in his left eye had broken from violent contact back on the ice, turning that once white mass a solid red so that he looked demonic. "Surrender or die!" he yelled, throat hoarse. He remained leaning way forward, staring out at the silent storm like he himself had frozen. No cars came in the other direction. Someone crossed the road on foot way up ahead, moving out of the dense acreage of trees on one side, fast and moving toward the other, east to west, maneuvering through the snow with strange ease. Someone out there in the middle of nowhere. We were at least a mile from the pond. They plunged back into the forest near a yellow sign that marked a sharp, upcoming curvature in the pavement, and we lost sight of them. Him, her, it. I can only say they had a head and a body and legs. I drifted away then, letting go of consciousness. Ike remained sharp and determined to get us home, and that is just what he did. When I eventually woke up, he was lying on my ratty sofa, still fully dressed, just like me, and it was Monday, 6:04 a.m., and our bodies were crying out for help we were horribly slow to give them. What was the exact point that day when you first thought it all wasn't real? Do you remember? I asked Ike the year before he moved away from Gillick Lake to Maryland to be closer to his kids. It broke his heart to move away, but that was what he felt he had to do. 1959, that was. "I guess," he told me, "when I saw those guys were basically already there that second time, it didn't make sense they'd be there so ready." That was when I started having those thoughts. All 3 of us were calm when we drove back to Bluebell Road together a day and a half after the combat. Not nervous, not frantically discussing our terror of being arrested. I knew for sure there was nothing more to fear when I saw that the name on that road sign was not, in fact, Bluebell Road. It was called Blue Coat Road. The letters could not have been more clear, though I had seen them differently several times, on both the way in and the way out. And Blue Coat is how it appears on maps today. Through the woods we had trudged one more time, having to leave the truck quite far away because of the snow accumulation. Our injuries were very true. For starters, the area all around Ike's right eye was a deep midnight blue, and Lenny's limp was going to last for weeks. The surface of the pond had been well blanketed, but there were clearly no bodies hidden under that snow. We stood and just looked for a moment, appreciating the serenity of the spot, its natural beauty. We were holding landscaping picks that Lenny's new business owned. They would have hacked holes into the ice pretty easily, just in case there were bodies to be sunk into that shallow water. We turned, went home, and a month later, as we expected, it had become obvious no one had ever found anything out there, and never would. And if I had thought the silence among the 3 of us about our time at war was thick, the pond really vanished into our interior vaults, and it stayed there for a very long time. Was there anything else but shock when you realized they were dead? I asked Lenny once in 1957, sitting in Dex's pub, 3 whiskeys into the night. He was living just 2 blocks away from me then, and still does today. You mean pride? Was there pride? He asked me. He was really starting to struggle with his weight then, and still does. And I worry about him a lot, and I try to keep him away from diners. But with kids in both our lives, we don't see each other all that often. Pride is pretty much the word I mean, I think, I said to him. And he thought about it for a long time, and then he slowly nodded. Yeah, I remember the way he had looked when he pounded his fists on the dashboard of the truck, and I had almost joined him. But that feeling had more or less vanished by the time I'd woken up on the floor of my apartment. It felt to Lenny like the suspension of truth began with the first moment of assault from Larson that second time around. I saw the sky when he hit you, Lenny told me, and that sky didn't look anything like it ever had. Nothing looked right. So I just let myself go. Lenny believes that if we were to dig around just a little, we would find 3 guys who are now in their 40s living out past Gulport. And if someone were to really jog their memories, they'd remember a rough day of hockey with 3 strangers who weren't any good, who couldn't take a little contact, and had left after 45 minutes or so. They'd remember all going back home then and picking up their little lives. They'd be completely out of shape today, probably, and drinking would have taken at least one of them down, but they'd be around the county somewhere. And yeah, this notion of Lenny's kind of makes sense to me, too. As for me, I think reality didn't fully return until just after I saw that strange person run across rural Route 10, just barely grazed by the truck's headlights in the gloom and the heavy snowfall. No one should have been out there, not that far out, not in that weather, and not without a coat. Something about that figure's movement was not quite natural. They were across that road and then back into the trees too fast, like they weren't even using their legs to move. I have told only my oldest daughter that I would testify they were gliding over the snow. But no one has ever asked that I pledge the truth about that day to them. It's called the Lyra Forest, but I've never found any history of the area that explains how it got that name. It's still a place colored by people's superstitions and tall tales, pervading through the generations. The Lyra Forest story Ike's crazy father told him is the one I'll always remember most, naturally. It's been 2 decades since the pond, which itself seems to have no name and no history. I've never been back there. I always turn around before I get that far. Today, I'm just sitting here in my little house, trying to remember everything about my kills and what the thought of them did to me in the decades after. In trying to understand that, I've put my thoughts on paper and read them again and again, and looked at maps and checked my facts, and even revisited the memorial beside that gas station we stopped at, and the bar and grill still owned and tended by Sergeant Mickey Rankling of the 11th Armored Division, talking to him for half an hour about whether he'll ever sell the place. And though I will never tell my children this, the answer to the very private question, what did my kills do to me, is that while I took no pride in them, I did feel, on that day and for months after, finally fed. I know that same word applies to Ike and Lenny too, but we do not speak about it. I hope you will understand we are still human. Tomorrow is Sunday, a day of rest. I'm going to church as usual, where I usually add a little prayer for peace in Vietnam to my thoughts about my family and friends. And then I'm going fishing to the south on Lake Lancer. Lenny will be working on his car, I think. It's having transmission problems. And somewhere in the woods around Blue Coat Road, I think maybe plans will be hatched and squares drawn in preparation for the nighttime's mischievous game.